This is Maiku, and you are listening to The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. This is a podcast that is dedicated to stories and tellings of my spiritual experiences. Some of the stories I will be sharing will cover many topics such as the parallels in spirituality and mental health, ghost stories, dreams, tarot reading, mediumship, and more. I do want to provide a disclaimer that these are all just based on my personal experiences. I do not have any certification in spiritual healing or mental health therapy, nor do I have an altar to practice Hmong shamanistic healing or rituals. Many of the stories I will be sharing are based purely on my personal experiences and how I have made sense of them throughout the years. So to those who are listening to this podcast, I hope that you will enjoy my stories and join me on the narrow path in the floating mountains.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry, you were right. Just leave me be, I'm not gonna put up a fight.
For this episode, I talk about when I realized and accepted my spiritual journey. I do want to preface that for this episode, it would be more of like a think piece. And that in a way it's intended to just kind of reflect some of the thought processes that I went through in the early stages of my spiritual journey, even though I highly believe that my spiritual journey started way before I was in this lifetime. But I will be talking mostly from the moment of like me actually acknowledging and being aware of like these are the things that I need to deal with. Also, if I sound sick, it's because I'm recovering from my chest cold, and so if you were wondering, I am recovering. This episode comes in inspiration from my last or some of my previous episodes where I talk about like, do I have the gift, right? Answering that question. And I think a great follow-up to that is just kind of talking about when I accepted my spiritual journey or when I accepted my path. And I think it's mostly, I kind of want to reframe that question as like not accepting it, but more so like becoming aware and realizing it. So I share this because I feel that a lot of people also question this. It's like once you realize you have this gift, like how do you come to like accepting it? And there's many things that I had to go through to finally be like, no, this is it. Like this is, you're actually doing it. I think that's something I feel that is important to know is that you don't have to go through like an actual initiation process. I think it comes more so as like a something that you arrive to in your own thought and reflection. And so I questioned a lot if I wanted to like read off a script to talk about this, but as I'm like reading what I wrote down, I'm realizing like a lot of what I was writing was my mental notes at the moment of writing and not an overall like reflection of my process so far. But there's a lot that I had gone through before I finally was like, oh, this is what my spiritual journey looks like. And it was only in hindsight that I finally realized, like, I'm already on this path. Like, what are you talking about? So how did it begin, right? As far as I can think of, in terms of like where it started, when did I start becoming aware? I think it started when I was in college because it was around that time when I started to become brave enough to start talking about my trauma. Oh, and then I also forgot that if you're easily triggered, There are a few topics that I may share. I'm just going off of my heart and talking about or answering this question. And so there may be themes of sexual trauma and unaliving. And so if you're easily triggered by these topics, then by all means, you can click out of this episode. And so going back to kind of where I started, in hindsight, reflecting and thinking about where did this start, I really think it started in graduate school, where I was finally brave enough to start unpacking some of the trauma that I experienced, specifically sexual trauma from childhood. So childhood sexual trauma. And I was entering my second year of graduate school, and my professors were starting to hound me about like, okay, you really have to find like kind of like a theme or a topic or a subject to address, because right now a lot of your work doesn't have substance, right? Because a lot of my work in the first year was just exploring. They kind of advise you to explore techniques and just the technique that you want to focus on before you work on a heavy topic or a topic with substance, a concept with substance. And so I was going into my second year, I was like, well, yeah, I'm going to work on like Hmong textiles and preserving it, and the role of women and preserving like textile traditions. And so this underlying theme of like the woman's role in our culture started coming up. And at that time, I was like a little baby, like Hmong feminist, right? And so I started just thinking about like, oh, this is why we had to do it, all the things that a baby like feminist would be going through, like just really angry and really like feeling an urgency to like put that information out there that, hey, this is what's problematic with our culture, like let's try to fix it, or let's try to like undo some of this oppression. And so I was starting to dive deep in it, and then I was also participating in focus groups for a local nonprofit. And so I knew the program coordinator, and I don't even know if she offered an invitation or she did. I can't remember, but I ended up participating in the focus group. And it was a focus group to think about like what a support group or what would survivors of sexual abuse like need. And at that time you participated and you didn't have to disclose if you were a survivor or not, but I felt really connected to that, and so I started participating. And so as we're talking about it, me and another participant shared, and it kind of like it triggered me, not in like a bad way, but it triggered me to where I was like, oh my god, like this is resonating with me right now. And I'm like, I need to, like, I don't know what to do. I'm like, I feel like I need to share. I'm like, sharing is supposed to help, right? In my head, that's what I was thinking. Sharing helps, right? So my idea of support was kind of like what I saw on TV, right? Like support groups and focus groups, and then just talking in a huge like circle, right? That was my perception of it, because I've never had that experience, or if not that, it was like one-on-one therapy. And so I thought the safest route was like these support or focus groups. And so as she's sharing with me, I'm like, I think now is the time for me to share. And it was like the floodgates were open, and I just started sharing. And not to the extent of how much I wanted to share, I would just share like, hey, this happened to me too. And so because it was a focus group, there was still questions being asked of like, okay, what would you need, right? What would help you? And so I just kind of thought like talking about it helps, and so having a support group would help. And so I was like, the first time that I shared like what I had experienced was, I thought like, okay, I did it, I'm gonna heal now, right? At this point, I wasn't even on anything that had to do with spirituality yet. I was still like very like grounded, very like things need to change in our community, like very social justice and human rights minded. And so I started thinking about I need to heal this now, and I need to do it now, or else like I'm never going to be healed. So that was my urgency. And so after this focus group, I went home and I started hyperventilating, and I went into a full-blown like anxiety attack in my room. Like I went in, I closed the door, and I was like, oh my god, I need to get out of here, you know. And so like I went through all of that, and like a few weeks later, like I moved out from my family's home because I was like, I need to do this by myself, right? So when I ended up moving out was also the same time when I was still in my second year of college, and then simultaneously, I think what happened too was that a lot of my so in studio arts at the studio arts program at the university I was going to, we do like huge critique sessions. And so in critique, like it's natural that people just ask questions, right? They do critiques to see like what is effective, and then also having like discussions around like themes, because it was at graduate level, it's very philosophy and theory based. And so I would get a lot of questions, and I didn't even know how to navigate these like discussions, or how to moderate them. And so I took it as like questions that were being asked to me. Like I had to keep tweaking my work, so I kept tweaking my work based on what people were sharing with me. And so I ended up like just being so conflicted about it. And the more people asked me questions, the more I just tried to seek like an indefinite answer. And it came down to the point where like, you know, my professor asked me like, why do you keep making work about like the female body, right? And I was like, well, because I have sexual trauma from childhood. And so I started unpacking that, like using that to unpack like my healing and what it was. And I didn't have like the vocabulary, I didn't have like these skills to know how to again like moderate discussions about that. And so I just kept making, and I eventually arrived at like an idea of like, well, why do I make? How can I bring in some things that I knew from my cultural background to inform like the art that I was making? But I didn't want to duplicate it in a way where it's like, oh, you're just doing the Hmong thing, right? Which is not against, I think it's great that people use Hmong culture to make art and bring awareness. At the same time, I also struggled with this, was that it was a scapegoat to use your culture to like be the ground or the foundation for discussion. But that's how I felt at the time. I obviously don't feel that way now, but I like fought it for so long, and then finally I started using it in my work. And so it just became a part of my visual language to use my culture to unpack a lot of the things that I dealt with, because a lot of times too, the concept that I was talking or trying to unpack have dealt with a lot of traditional like roles and how sexual trauma was dealt with in our culture. And so I struggled with this because I kept going back and forth. Like I didn't know like what I was doing. I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just like, just work on your work, use it to understand whatever it is that you're trying to do. What is it? Like don't don't worry about what anybody else is gonna say. And of course, like, there were times where people were really critical, or people were just like outright mean, and I didn't know that it was them being malicious at the time, but now I'm like, oh hell no. But I realized that stage of my life was kind of like the huge, like the crack in the earth, right? That opens up, like what am I trying to say? I'm trying to use a metaphor. Kind of like the thing that opened up all these like unhealed things that I have been dealing with. The only way I can describe it is like Pandora's box, you know, when Pandora opens the box and then all of these like things came out that caused more strife and struggle onto the people, right? And so in a way, like it really messed me up. It messed me up so bad that I was being really messy. I ended up like avoiding my work. I ended up not being as productive as I'd wanted to be. I was like a really I didn't have like, I just had no, I think because I was so focused on my healing that it was hard for me to even try and relate to people. And so it either desensitized me or made me more sensitive, because there were times where I just felt like the whole world was against me. And so I ended up like unpacking a lot of these things through my work, and in arriving at my final series of work to graduate, because I had to graduate, I started looking into like spiritual practices and rituals in the Hmong culture. And the one thing that I was really struck by was like the process of like putting up daisuka, and that was like the only thing that I could think of. And then there was also like soul calling and the shaman rituals and things, but I felt like at that time like that's inaccessible, right? Because I felt like you had to have a certain skill, you had to learn a certain thing to be able to do it. And me being like a super Hmong American, like I didn't have access, or I wasn't taught that growing up. And so I just kind of took bits and pieces from it the way that I could in understanding it. And so I started just looking at certain elements as pieces of my work, and I started creating like these altars out of fabric. And then I started like just playing around with like red dye, and eventually I started something. I think one of my professors was like, this is something that you've always been interested in, like why not just jump into it, like the use of red, like why the red, right? And so I started thinking about like, well, red has a symbolic importance in our culture as being really protective, right? Like the red little triangle charms, the red like hand ties, which are specific to like Buddhist culture or Buddhism, but we've adopted it, and that's just become a part of our spiritual practice. And so I thought about that. I thought a lot about that, and I just became obsessive with like dyeing red fabric. And then my professor told me, you gotta stop just making and just start like just playing around with stuff and start making. And so then I ended up thinking about like, because it was going to be about sexual trauma, I started focusing on like that sacral area, right? The sacral area, the sexual organs, and how to become more empowered, because I've always had a strange relationship with my menstrual cycle and my body. I still have a complicated relationship with my body. And so the one thing that I felt was truly empowering and was really mine was like my menstrual cycle, because it like whenever my cycle was irregular, that I knew like something was not okay with me. Like I was stressed out. At the same time too, because people were so grossed out by it, both like mostly men that the men that I had knew anyways, that I was like, oh, this is like a perfect deterrent, right? So I started using the image of like the menstrual stain as like my symbol of protection. And so as I was creating these like menstrual like stains, I started calling them, like, because then they were asking me, I was being asked, like, what do you call these marks? Like, menstrual stain? Or what is it? And so I started embodying, like, this like, I wouldn't say alter ego, because it's, well, I guess in a way, but it's not really an alter ego, because it's not something separate from me. It's something that I embody, too. Like, there's aspects of this that I practice in my regular life, and that it's not just performance. But like I started embodying this figure or this energy of like the shaman, right, quote unquote shaman, and how I perform these rituals to do healing for myself. At that time I didn't know too much about like the role of shamans too, because I do feel that spiritual like rituals that deal with like heavy deep-rooted trauma is very inaccessible to your regular like home folk, right? And so a lot of these heavy like healing processes were only accessible to Hmong shamans, and that even though the situation was not like as dire as like going into a trance and recalling the spirit or doing like a work in the spiritual world, that sometimes like it could be resolved by just purely like doing the spiritual work on your own. And so I started thinking like, well, if it's that inaccessible, why don't I just create my own rules to do healing for myself, right? How can I create a process that is healing for myself? I think at the time too, I explored a lot about like how trauma affects the psyche, and I didn't know that I was doing this at the time, but how much the psyche is informed by the spiritual too. And so a lot of these things were just kind of converging together. I didn't know what they were called at the time, but I just kind of went with like the script, right, of okay, Michael, you're gonna become the shaman, you're gonna perform these rituals to heal yourself from these traumas, and you're gonna create these pieces, and it's gonna be an altar. Like you're gonna create these altars that are that not necessarily worship, but are paying respect to you and the trauma that you dealt with and how you've come out of it. Like, how can you turn this traumatic situation into an empowering process? And so I started creating like these altars, and I didn't know what it was, but I think I read somewhere that, you know, the moon cycle is in folklore, the moon cycles are connected to like the menstrual cycles. It's not, I kind of feel like it is and it isn't, but I started becoming I had like a deep affinity for like the moon, right? And this idea of the moon goddess. And so I started calling these stains ritual markings of moon goddess. And so that's what my altars were. They were consisting of like ritual markings from this moon goddess who ruled over like the sacral area, and would empower it and would send energy to this area to heal, right? That's where I was essentially channeling energy to heal. I didn't know that that's what it was at the time, but like I guess it was. And then I was also very inspired by other artists who dealt with like subjects of the body and goddesses, and also like other ideas of the body as abundant and creating life and a source of energy and healing it. One artist who I became really, really obsessed with at the time was Ana Mendieta, and she's since passed. She had a very like tragic death, but I was really obsessed to her work, and she did like these performance pieces in an almost ritualistic way, where she was either like healing the earth by creating these goddess figures, or she would be doing like rituals that look very similar to like Santa Maria, and so she wouldn't like kill chickens, but they would be, what was it? I think she did kill a chicken one time, and she just let that chicken like flap, and the blood would just like splatter onto her body. But for me, I'm like, oh, Hmong people, like, we kill chickens all the time. We slaughter chickens to eat, right? Like, for both ceremonies, but not just out of like, you know, for the sake of killing, right? And so we would, anyways, I digress. But I became like obsessed with Ana Mendieta, and I was like, oh my god, like I really enjoy this. I didn't know what it was at the time, but in hindsight, I started realizing that I was so fascinated with it because there was an aspect of like spiritual and like the physical and having to do with like the body and healing. And so I think like really when I realized like my path was during this period of my life, and again, it was very messy. Even afterwards, it was messy. Like, that was just the beginning of it, of me when I realized it. But I did all of that, and then I started going. I found a job after I graduated. I found a job. Did the job that I had sought out to do. Like, you know, this is what it was one of those jobs where I was like, yeah, I finally did it. You know, I'm like living the dream of like going to college and getting a salary paying job doing what I'm doing, and that this was going to be it. This was going to be like the stepping stone to help heal basically like the family lineage. So doing like ancestral work. I didn't know that that's what it was called at the time, but like generational or historical or ancestral trauma. And that for me, I was thinking about it in the way of like, I'm gonna heal, like this is going to be really helpful for my children and my grandchildren, and you know, everyone who comes after. And so I thought about it like that, but now understanding everything that I know now, I was hoping to do ancestral, generational, and historical trauma healing. That's what I thought, but it kind of was pushed aside again, because then I became a mom, and I struggled with another level of trauma where I didn't know. I struggled a lot with like, would I be a good enough mom? Or, you know, am I even prepared yet? Or how is this like affecting, how is this going to affect like my children? Like, how is my trauma going to affect my child? And so I think it was a combination of just being really stressed out from work too, and really burnt out, that I came to realizing the spiritual aspect of my path like by chance. And how I thought about it was like, I had always been interested in astrology, and so I was using astrology to help motivate me to like move forward. And then it was very superficial. Like, it would just be like, oh, hey, you know, this is what's gonna happen today. But I didn't take it as seriously as I did now. I think at the time too, it was still kind of like it wasn't taken as seriously then either. And this was like in 2015, 2016. And then my husband, he had always been into crystals, and he had a list of crystals that he wanted, but he never really got anything for himself. And then it was like one year, it was his birthday, I decided that I was gonna buy him the crystal that he had, because he was like telling me about it, but I didn't quite understand like the use of crystals, but he had. I think it's because when he used to live out in Seattle, like it was pretty prominent out there already. Um, and so when he was telling me about this, I'm like, oh, okay, crystals, that's cool. I always connected it to like geology and like how pretty they looked, or because I had taken a science class way back when, and we talked about like the hardness of certain materials, and so I was familiar with like the quartz and the pyrite, but I didn't know like there was this whole other world, right? And so my husband was telling me that he had a list, and that crystals kind of give off energy or vibrations that help with like healing. And I found his list because I was cleaning up stuff. I found his list. I'm like, oh, this would be perfect. This is a perfect gift for him. So I went on Etsy and I bought him like a smoky quartz. And it arrived, and the person who sold it to us was like, oh yeah, I've cleansed it in full moon and da da da. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is cool. I can get with this. But didn't do too much with that until like we were already we already had my son, and things were just escalating for me, like my prophetic dreams, my mediumship experiences, all of that was just like going haywire. And things at work wasn't doing well, but then if say like I prayed that today would go well because I do not have the stamina to deal with a certain person's like energy, that person would not show up. And so I'm like, oh my god, this is like for real right? And so I would tell my sister about this, and we would have like spiritual talks, and she was the one that would always be like, oh my god, like I found this and you should try it too. And so she found a crystal shop that was close to where her old studio was, and so I was like, oh, like I want to go too. I think my first time I did go with her, but I can't remember. I think I did go with her one of the first times, and she was like sharing those things with me, because then I think before we went I started researching things, and so is going more in depth into it. And so how she came to crystals was that I think she saw it somewhere and she just got really into it, and then next thing I know, she had like a huge like purchase. She came over with like a huge cardboard box of like crystals, and she was like telling me about it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. Like I'm like, okay, like it was really new to me, so I didn't know how to like I didn't know how to process it. But the more I looked into it, and the more like I had these conversations with my husband, because I felt like he was more spiritual than I was. I think it's also because his parents, they were they definitely do more spiritual like practices or rituals, or they're more in tune with the spiritual healing part than how we were raised. We just kind of treated spirituality as like something benign, and that every so often like you have an experience and then that's it, right? Neither like skeptical or like a firm believer, but it was just kind of there. And so with my husband, I think he grew up where it was just a normal thing. Like if something unfortunate were to happen, then they would look into it spiritually. And so my husband, I felt like he was definitely more spiritual than I was, in understanding how that all worked. But eventually I became the one who was like more obsessive and going into it more, like doing the research to be like, oh my god, like you can do this to like heighten this. And so anyways, my sister started getting into crystals and I did, and then I think that's really what propelled me into like exploring other means of spirituality to do healing. And I started getting into like doing channeling the moon, and they fluctuate back and forth, and so naturally it was just the moon that I had become accustomed to because that was in my work. And the more that I delved into unpacking like my trauma, the more it just seemed right to do it by way of like spirituality. And so how this goes back to like my sexual trauma, right? So I started also, my sister had introduced me to a psychic. She was like, oh yeah, you should totally do a reading and just kind of see how it is. And I had a reading with this psychic, and I was really skeptical. But open. And she ended up picking up on some of the things that I was currently struggling with. And she told me, like, I have to forgive and move forward. And that if I wanted to work with... she had picked up that I was, like, an artist. And I was an artist, or I dealt with creativity. And that there was a blockage in my sacral. And it was due to, like, she didn't really pinpoint what it was, actually. And so she was looking into that, and she told me to work with a carnelian, right? And so then after that was when I started buying, like, crystals to do healing work in my energetic field, in my chakra. And then the more I researched too, the more information just clicked. The more it just made sense to equate some of the emotional and mental like blockages with spiritual blockages, and looking for answers by way of trusting my intuition. And I was finding a lot of resources on how to trust your intuition. A lot of it was through the lens of spirituality. And from there, I just started trusting the process. I just kind of took it as like, having a spiritual like explanation for it, rather than like just gaslighting myself. Because for me, I had to figure out like how to unpack whatever it is I was dealing with on the spiritual, through the spiritual lens, but also interpreting it in a mental health and an emotional health type of way. And the language isn't that different when we're talking about spiritual and emotional or mental health healing. The language isn't that different. And so it was easy for me to translate or interpret like spiritual messages and meanings through like in like mental and emotional like well-being. And so that's how things started connecting for me. It was like, oh, I'm having a blockage here is because, or I'm dealing with insecurity here because my sacral is blocked, and my sacral is where like confidence and creativity comes from. It is also the chakra that is blocked because of my sexual trauma. And so it just kind of made sense, right? And so I started listening more to that. I started listening to my body physically and energetically, and also how I was processing that. And in a way, I was able to self-diagnose a little bit more. It also expedited a lot of not so nice like things that I was dealing with. So I knew that due to my sexual trauma, my childhood sexual trauma, that I had a lot of insecurity and depression from high school. And so that just kind of stuck around. Like, depression was just always around me. And I used to get gaslighted. People used to tell me, like, no, you're not depressed. You're just, like, being stupid, or you're not making the right decisions. Or, like, you don't have anything to be stressed out about. Like, you're just a kid. And so I internalized that and just continued to like gaslight myself until like again I had my son, and things happening on a hormonal level, but spiritual and paranormal level was just like going haywire. When I became a mom, everything was just going like crazy, and I started getting more vivid dreams. I started getting more panic attacks. I started getting more psychic attacks, and just being very sensitive to everything. Like I remember one time I had this fear of like losing my son, and my son, I was like really connected to my son. So I kind of want to do another episode on just when I became a mom and dealing with postpartum and the things that I dealt with, but I think I'll share this as like kind of an opening to that. So I was very intuitively connected to my son, where if something was going to happen to him, like I would just get this feeling like, oh my God, I need to pay attention to him. There were times where he would cry profusely and there wouldn't be anything. It wasn't colic, because he had nights where he could sleep through, or he was just being a baby. And so in addition to that too, I started getting this overwhelming feeling of like someone was going to take my child away, and I started like meditating on it, and I knew where it was coming from. I knew that on an emotional and mental level, it was that I was dealing with my unhealed trauma, and I had to figure out like, what are you going to do to alleviate that? And it manifested as this fear, right? This mental health and this emotional like instability for me manifested as like this entity that was trying to take my son away. And I had to like ward it off. And so I would channel the energy of being a protective mom and trusting that, you know, nothing is going to happen, and that he's connected to me forever, and that I have the ability to create a protective shield over him. And so whenever I found myself feeling that way, I would always like cast a protective shield over him and just kind of talk away that entity or that spirit that was trying to take him away. And the thing is, like, I had a vision of the edge of the skirt of a woman from like the Victorian days, and at the time it just felt like it was following me, and I just could not like put him down or let him go. And so I ended up focusing on my mental health that way, was to channel like this energy of like the protective mother, and that nothing, even if it was something like that, was not going to take it away. I think it also was because I did have this innate fear that someone was going to take my child away, because I was not an efficient mother, or I was not like a good enough mom. And so that's kind of how I channeled, and it also propelled me into thinking like, Maiku, like, you really have to heal this part of you so that you can be a present mom and you can be a strong mom for him. And so that was how like it was balanced. Like, on one hand, I understand the spiritual aspect. On the other hand, I also understood like the emotional and mental aspect of it. And so that was something that I struggled with in that period, but eventually like I just got better and better at it. I think it was because of the things that just started happening quicker and quicker, that I was propelled into this role as being my own spiritual healer and being the spiritual healer for my family, and at the same time too just being like all mentally and emotionally secure. At that time too, when I had my son too, or when my son was about like 1 or 2, I was also doing like therapy, behavioral therapy. I realized it was helpful to talk about it, but the therapist really wasn't, I just didn't feel good about this therapist. And so I ended up, she told me that, if I'm doing well, then, we could just meet. If she kind of left it up to me, like if I wanted to meet whenever I needed to, or do we want to make it a regular thing. And I just told her if we could just schedule these meetings whenever I needed to talk, like that's fully fine with me. And the thing was, like, these, even though our insurance covered it, it is not cheap. It is not cheap. Like, once, I think even with the benefits that we had, I was only allowed up to like 8 or 12 sessions a year. And it made me realize a lot of things about mental health, accessibility to mental health services, that empowered me even more to find a process that would help me, things that I already knew how to do without putting it into someone else's hand, because that was something that I struggled with too, was constantly seeking healing from others who didn't fully understand what I was going through, or just understood it by way of like how they understood it. And so it shed a light on an issue that became really important for me, was accessibility to mental health services, that I felt like many people needed. Many people like me, who was a childhood sexual abuse victim, a survivor, that needed it, specifically in our community too. And I had worked with an organization who had these services, but it was like not that great, because I later found out that the person was like really problematic, and that the person prior to her was let go. She was actually the one who I was going to, but she was let go, and that's a whole other thing that I'm not going to go into. I don't plan to go into, but the services, mental health services for sexual abuse victims, and I'm only speaking about it from that perspective, but in general, mental health resources are just not inaccessible, right? So for me as like survivor, and having gone through this process, I was like, damn, this is really shitty. And it's so unfortunate that so many of us who really need it, when we are granted the opportunity, that it's a crappy like experience, right? So that whole experience, in hindsight, like even though I was like on my spiritual journey, I didn't realize like how I already had the knowledge to do my own healing. I kept putting it into somebody else's hands, or thinking that I needed someone to hold my hand while I was doing this. And so I ended up like ending the services, and or I stopped going to my therapy because it wasn't helping me, and I didn't want drugs. I realized that what really helped me was to just talk about it. And then there was another thing that I wanted to share too. It made me feel even more inspired to try and seek other ways to heal emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And that was where, it wasn't that particular moment, but again, through all the things that I had gone through up until this point, it made me realize, like, you know what? This is why I go about it by way of my spiritual journey, because it feels more self-empowering that your healing is in your hands, that the resources are accessible. You can figure these things out. And for a person like me, obviously there are some people who will need that help, who will need that hand to hold. I think for me, if you are someone who is still able to manage your emotions and your mental health, that by doing it the way that of like seeking processes that are more self-empowering, or if you're able to do it yourself, then I feel like that is the most like effective way, right? If you're still able to do that. And I went through the whole process too with someone who is unable to make decisions, critical thinking decisions. And also going through that process with them was like, oh my God, like knowing the difference between like, okay, I am still capable of making decisions based on critical thinking and logic, but for people who aren't able to, like how much harder it is, right? And so for me, I'm like, well, I'd rather that if I'm still able to do it, I might as well do it for myself, and then use what I've learned to support others who are in the same like level or the same stage or the same phase as I am, because everyone's different. But I do feel that because of the lack of resources, that we are probably better off just seeking other forms of empowering, like spiritual healing or self-healing processes, rather than relying on someone else to do it for us, if under the circumstances that you're still able to resolve things, think about things logically and critically. And so that was something that I struggled with too. I kept going to like healers. I kept trying to figure out like, I don't know what's going on with me. I just want someone to help me like do this. And I kept getting disappointed because I kept putting my healing in the hands of others, and I was getting answers that were not intended for me, or the answers where I was trying to find answers was not where I was supposed to find them. And it sounds very cliche and corny, but in the end I realized like it was all things that I already knew and knew how to do. And it was by way of my personal experiences arriving to where I'm at that I can recall those things. It was like putting all the puzzle pieces together. It was like, oh yeah, go back to this because this is how you were able to, like, that made sense to you. So use that to make sense in the present, to branch out and find more that can heal that particular like thing that you're trying to heal. And so I was doing a lot of that, and then simultaneously I was doing that with like finding resources for like spiritual resources, but also mental health, going back and forth. I figured out like the balance for me that worked was that I find a spiritual resource, I make sense of it, and then I apply it to the mental health aspect of like whatever it is that I was dealing with, and I use it as a way to be like, okay, spiritual, intangible, mental health and emotional, still intangible, but more on the physical plane, more critical thinking, right? The logic and the thinking. And that's kind of how I worked with it. And then on top of that too, I started thinking about like how I had, through this process, it informed my role as like a healer, right? That I don't have to be a healer for others. I should just be focused on healing myself, because there was a part of my journey too where I kept thinking like, oh, people are telling me like I have this like ability to like help others heal, But I don't know what that looks like. Am I supposed to be like a shaman? Am I supposed to be like a spiritual healer for others? Am I supposed to be doing like Reiki? Am I supposed to be doing like energy healing? Like, I didn't know what that was. And I kept thinking like that's the direction that I should go to try it out. But I would, and then something would just happen where it would just not work out. Like, I just wouldn't be able to see to the end of it because of like certain like events that would interfere. And so I kept going. I kept having this experience of being gaslighted to like, oh yeah, you're supposed to do all of these things, but you know, it's not necessarily like the thing that you're supposed to do. And I kept going back and forth with that. It was like, yeah, you're supposed to do this, but there wouldn't be a follow-up. And then I was seeing how other people were getting like advice or being shown the way, and I'm like, what? Like, how come I'm not getting that? You know? And the people who were, they were like, oh, you know, I don't want to do it though. I'm like, what? And so I was equating like spiritual healing and being a healer for others with like a sense of uniqueness and worth, and that they were fulfilling their purpose, whereas I feel like I wasn't fulfilling my full purpose. And I realized it came back down to like self-worth, right? How much do I believe in myself to like be fulfilling my purpose, right? And I came to the conclusion that, you know, it's not about that at all. It's about like just taking care of yourself and healing. Like, you don't have to be nobody's healer. If anything, like, you teach them how to heal themselves. And you're not the person, you're not the like spiritual doctor to heal people. It's just through like the things that you share, that's how you heal people too. And so I came to that conclusion not too long ago, maybe like when the pandemic started, but I was like, you know, Maiku, you don't have to be a shaman. Maybe that's not even for you. You know, hell, like, that's not for you. But you can help others heal by just sharing what you're sharing, and through your work, through some form of expression, through some form of talking, because that's how people connect with you, is through talking, having conversations. Even with my clients, like, I feel like it's not really my work, it's actually the conversations that we have that's becomes more fruitful. And so I started realizing, like, you know, there's no, like, how can I say this? My worth is not depending on how I do healing. I realized that, and I was like, you know, screw that. Like, I'm gonna heal myself, you know? I'm gonna heal my ancestral lineage by healing myself. I'm gonna heal by being the best mom that I can be for my son. And, you know, everything that I've experienced, yeah, it's true. Why do you keep going to people who don't even see that, who wasn't there with you? I think I shared this with another episode, because I'm feeling like this is something that I've said before. But, you know, I think because I keep saying it's like the overall message that I want to share with people who are trying to figure out, like, am I supposed to be a shaman, or am I supposed to be a healer, or, you know, like, who equate that role with a sense of worth, self-worth. That's mainly why I share it, because that's where I was. I kept thinking, like, oh, I can only be someone if I'm healing others. I can only be someone if I'm working for someone. I think until I decided to open up the studio was when I started realizing in my own power and worth. Even when I started when I opened my studio, I was thinking, like, oh, you know, I want to be like, this is how I want it, because this is how it works out for someone else. And I would do that, or I would be like, no, I want to do it like this because this isn't working out for other people, so I'm going to do the opposite, you know? So it was still it was still founded on this base of somebody else's standards, and it wasn't my standards. So I started just thinking from a place of, Michael, create your own standards. Create your own standards and improve yourself from there. And simultaneously, I was doing that through my work too, is that try not to do what somebody else is doing, do what you feel most connected with. The same thing was also applicable to my spiritual journey. Like, you don't have to be doing tarot readings like other people. Just do it the way that you're doing it. Just read it the way you're reading it. Do things intuitively and how it's gonna help work out for you. I think that was something that I struggled with my artwork too in college. A lot of how I did my work was based on the critiques of others, and that was how I lived my life, as like a people pleaser. And then of course, like, things popped up where I started to just develop a sense of self and standing up for myself, and also like owning up to the mistakes and realizing like, oh, you can always bounce back from this. That it just became easier. I'm like, you know what? You mess up, you own up to it, and you keep on going, because how else is it gonna hurt you, right? That's how I reason with it. Obviously, like, with people saying things and it hurting you, like, honoring what you're feeling at the moment as well. That was something that I felt too. It was like, no, my goo, like, believe yourself that you're dealing with this, and how do you process it? So I think that pretty much takes me to where I am now. I really didn't know when I accepted it until I thought more about it. Like, even when I realized, like, Michael, you don't have to be a healer. Just do what you're doing. You don't have to, like, be this messiah type healer, or this, like, healer that has a following, because guess what? That's called a cult. But just believing in your own healing process, your own spiritual journey, right? Everybody has their own spiritual journey. Nobody is in control of that other than you, and going along with it. I started going down that path. I started believing, like, started also channeling the idea that I don't have to be living somebody else's life, and I can only live my life in the best way that I know how to live it. And so that's kind of where it was coming from until things just clicked. I think it was more so of things clicking, and then only until a few weeks ago, when I was doing this podcast and I came up with the idea about talking about, like, when did I accept it, that I was like, I think I always accepted it. It was always in my path. In terms of becoming aware, I definitely became more aware when I realized that how I was making sense of things was making sense was making sense to me, and that it was only working for me. That it was only working for me, and that nobody else would know how to do it the way that I do it other than me. Was when I realized, I'm like, oh dang, this really is my journey. And it just kind of fell into place. There's really no way to get to it other than going through what you're dealing with. Because again, there was also a time where I was like trying so hard to like prove that I can do these things that it got me in trouble. I not necessarily with other people, but I got myself in trouble with myself. That's what happened. And I was like, oh shit, see, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that. And guess where you are at now. I think and then that translates into like self accountability, right? So it was a lot of self accountability, a lot of trial and errors, like I said in the last episode, and a lot of believing in myself and just trying to live my own path. That, you know, I think thinking about it afterwards, it was an intuitive way. It was I was subconsciously accepting it, you know. I'm so glad that it went this way, because I did have a script, but I felt that the way that I was writing things out is not resonating with how I'm feeling right now, because I wrote it out like a few days ago, but as I was reading it off, I'm like, man, my thoughts were everywhere, but now it's a little bit more organized, so I can just go off of like what my heart feels, right? And that's the message of this story too, is go off of not the story, but this episode is just go off of what your heart feels. Like, it's almost like the only person you really gotta believe that you really need approval from is yourself, like your heart. Like, your heart has never lied to you. You know, your heart and your thought, your higher self, has never lied to you, and it's always guided you to do the things that will serve you. And so that is pretty much it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you can tune in for the next episode, and I'll talk to you later. And that concludes this episode of The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tune in for the next one coming out soon.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry. You were right. Just leave